This week we're going to be taking a look at another Badger airbrush. This is the 105 Arrow. Over the last year or so, I received a fair amount of requests from viewers to make a video on the Arrow. So last October, I found it on Amazon for only $60 US. That's an incredible price, so I ordered it immediately. And so the standard disclaimer, just want you to know that I do not work with or for any airbrush or paint company. I do not accept free products to review. Just like every other airbrush that I reviewed on this channel, I bought this one with my own money. When you purchase this airbrush, it comes in a simple black cardboard box. You get some documentation for the Patriot 105, and this little manual has some excellent information in it. There's a nice diagram on the back that shows all of the parts and part numbers as well, which is always appreciated. And of course, you get the airbrush itself. It's in some black foam padding, and there's no extra accessories with this one. It's just the airbrush itself, and that includes a rubber or vinyl cap to protect the head system and needle tip, as well as this black plastic cover for the paint cup. And if you're wondering why this airbrush comes with the manual for the Patriot 105, that's just because this airbrush, the Arrow, is identical to the Patriot except for the color cup. So here are the two airbrushes side by side. The one we're looking at today, the Arrow, is on top, and the Badger Patriot 105 is at the bottom. They both spray identically because they both have the same nozzle setup that I'll talk about next. And so the major difference that you'll see between the two is just the size of the paint cup. Now this is just a preference, but I generally prefer a smaller cup on my airbrushes, and that's just because I don't use that much paint as I'm working. But the nice thing about the Arrow is that you get a lot more room for your trigger finger, and there isn't a large cup that might obstruct your view. With the Patriot 105, you can see that there's just not as much room for your trigger finger, but the nice thing about this is you could hold a lot more paint. The color cup of the Badger Patriot 105 holds 1/3 of an ounce, which is just under 10 milliliters. And for the 105 Arrow, the airbrush that we're looking at today, this one holds 1/16 of an ounce, which is just under 2 milliliters. For the 105 Arrow that I bought, it came with the detail setup, which is a 0.5 millimeter needle and nozzle. This 0.5, just like in the Patriot, is perfect for general use spraying, excellent and forgiving for some thicker paints, and it's also very capable for detail work as well, and we'll see that later on in the video. On the spray regulator, there's an F stamped in, which denotes the fine or the detail setup, as well as the blue bulb on the back of the needle. We're not going to be looking at them today, but there is a conversion kit you can get for a super detail, which is a 0.3, and there's also a larger general purpose setup, which is a 0.7. And again, this one is the detail setup at 0.5. Badger's rear handle design is my favorite from any airbrush company out there today. I've talked about this a bunch of times. We see the same thing on the Arrow here. There's a cutaway, and what's really nice about this is that you can easily access your needle while the rear handle is still connected. All I need to do is loosen up the needle chucking nut, and then the needle retracts right out of the back of the airbrush while that handle is still on. It's a simple design, but in my opinion, it's the best design out there today. And unlike the SOTAR 2020, the 105 Arrow has these two metal prongs at the back just to protect the back of the needle. In the hand, the Arrow is super comfortable to hold and paint with for longer sessions, and it feels nicely balanced with that smaller paint cup. Just like other Badger airbrushes, the trigger is soft to press down. It's a very smooth action pulling back as well. And you are able to adjust this trigger spring tension or resistance, as I'll show later on in the airbrush breakdown. The 105 Arrow has the standard round trigger pad that you're going to see on Badger airbrushes. There are a few grooves and a recessed center which offer some good grip on your trigger finger, and the height of this trigger is just perfect for me. It's not too tall and it's not too short. So from here, let's take a look at the finish of this airbrush underneath the macro lens, and it's actually quite nice on this one. The finish is not perfectly flawless as I've seen in some other brands, but this finish looks just fine to me. There's no complaints at all here. And keep in mind that this is filmed under a very nice macro lens in 4K, so this is going to show everything. And I do make sure to film these videos in high res so that you as the viewer can decide for yourself. But again, I'm pretty happy with this finish. It looks very nice. The color cup does have that groove cut out into the back of it with a few sharp angles in here, and I usually find this difficult to keep clean. Paint tends to collect in these grooves even after you've flushed everything out. So with this design, like on the new SOTAR 2020s and the chrome, I just have to spend a little bit of extra time at the end of the day to make sure this color cup is fully cleaned out before I put the airbrush away. The airbrush nozzle is also nicely centered within the front of the airbrush, which is always a nice thing to see. So from here, let's move along to a standard breakdown so that you can see all of the internal parts. One thing that I want to point out is that I have a BADGER adapter at the bottom of this airbrush. This way I can add a hardened steam bag quick disconnect to this arrow. And this way it just easily connects to my standard air hose. So the first thing that I'm doing here is unscrewing the needle chucking nut, and once that's loosened up a bit, I can retract the needle out of the back of the airbrush. And then I'll unscrew the rear handle and also unscrew that needle chucking nut, place both of them to the side. Here you'll see that small brass spring screw, and this is what I was talking about before. You could use this to adjust the trigger tension or the trigger resistance. If I loosen it up, that trigger is going to feel a lot lighter, and if I tighten it down, that's where I usually keep it, the trigger is just going to have a heavier feel to it. And you could set this wherever you'd like, it's all personal preference. Just in front of that is the tube shank, which has some knurling on it, and this is essentially the housing for the spring assembly, so if I unscrew it all the way, it will remove right out of the back of the airbrush. And I covered this assembly a bunch of times. It's the same one that is on all BADGER airbrushes that I reviewed on this channel. It consists of 4 parts: the spring screw, the spring, the tube shank, and the needle tube. It's definitely one of the more complex designs out today in modern airbrushes, but the nice thing about it is that it's well made and it gives you a good amount of trigger tension adjustability. And this assembly seems very nicely made to me. The parts have a nice finish, everything screws together very smoothly. Over to the body of the airbrush, once that needle is removed along with the spring assembly, the trigger is going to lift right out of the body of the airbrush. And just behind the trigger is the back lever. This one is separated from the rear assembly behind it, and so it's just a bit more difficult to put back together. And then moving along to the front of the airbrush, the first thing that I'm unscrewing here is the regulator. Once that's removed, you'll see the tip of the nozzle exposed as well as the front of the airhead cap. And you can see the 6 holes in the airhead nozzle cap that directs the airflow over the front of the nozzle. And if I fully unscrew this cap, the nozzle will lift right out of the body of the airbrush. And it's important to do this over something soft because it's just very easy to drop that nozzle. This is the entire head assembly broken down. It consists of 3 parts. And I just love the large nozzle design on this one because it's so easy to remove if you ever need to swap it out with a different size or to clean out any clogs. And there's no sort of threads on this nozzle, it's just friction fit, it's held in by compression. So you just place it into the body of the airbrush and then you take that air cap and screw it down. And as you tighten down that air cap, the nozzle is self-centering, but you just need to be careful here. There's a lot of soft brass parts in an airbrush, so you don't want to over-tighten anything, and you don't want to use any tools to tighten anything down. Just hand tight. And so the build quality and the manufacturing of all the internal parts is similar to every other BADGER airbrush that I've owned and showed on this channel. To finish up this video, we're going to cover my favorite thing about BADGER airbrushes. That's the way that they spray paint and the responsiveness of that trigger. As I was painting with this arrow, it feels exactly like the Patriot 105. And that's pretty obvious because the nozzle, the head assembly, and the internals are exactly the same as the Patriot 105. What I'm doing on this portrait is starting to fill in some of the values within the background. I want to add some of this paint in before pulling out some of the thin hairs. And for me personally, this is where an airbrush with a larger nozzle really shines when I'm filling in some larger areas. What's nice about this is that I can hold the airbrush a little bit farther back from the surface and apply a fair amount of paint and get it down evenly. And so after I scratched out a few of the hairs, what I'm doing here is glazing some of this black paint over the top. And trigger control is very, very important here because I want to make sure that I apply thin layers of paint exactly where I want it to be. I'm focusing more paint into the background, applying thin layers of black paint to build up to a final value of pure black. And I'm also adding a gradient into the hair here. This is the very early stages of painting this hair, but what I'm doing is applying some of that paint on that transition point between the hair and the background, just so it kind of fades away. And also on the other side, softening up that transition from the skin texture to the hair itself. This airbrush puts out a much higher volume of paint than the detail airbrushes that I was using to paint this portrait. And when I'm painting larger areas of value, this is where an airbrush like this really shines because you could fill in areas fast. And as long as the trigger control is on point, you can do exactly what you want to do with that airbrush. It makes it quicker to fill in large areas and also to get smooth transitions within those large areas. I still have a very long way to go with the hair here and those transition points, but when working on larger parts of the painting like this, nothing beats an airbrush with a 0.5mm nozzle and really good trigger control. Because I am spraying thicker paint here, I'm spraying it right from the bottle, and that larger nozzle just makes it so forgiving and easy to spray. But that's not to say that the 105 Arrow cannot spray detail. This one could spray it just as well as any other .5 airbrush. If I drop my working pressure to around 20 psi and I hold the airbrush close to the surface with some reduced paint, you can see I could pull off some very thin lines here. But an airbrush like this does put out a much higher volume of paint, so you need to be very careful with that trigger control. If you do pull too far back on this trigger, this airbrush is going to put out a lot more paint than a detail airbrush like a Sotar 2020. And that leads me to the final thing and my favorite thing about Badger airbrushes, that's the trigger control and the responsiveness of that trigger. I'm just spraying a few dots here to show you the trigger response. You can see that my trigger finger is barely moving. The slightest nudge backward, I get paint. I get it every single time at the exact same point. No surprises here. This is the same that I've seen on every single Badger airbrush that I've owned and used in the past. Just fantastic trigger control, very, very responsive. It's an airbrush just like the Patriot 105 that's going to do exactly what you want it to do. So there you go. That's my take on the 105 Arrow. It's basically a Patriot 105 with a smaller paint cup. It's just a fantastic airbrush for things like base coats, spraying thin layers of varnish, or painting bigger parts of a painting where a higher volume of paint is needed. And I couldn't be happier with the price that I picked this one up for either. I just know that just like my Patriot 105, it's going to spray thicker paint easily and consistently all day long. The Patriot 105 is a legendary airbrush, so there's no surprises with this one. I hope that this video on the 105 Arrow was helpful to some of you guys out there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you back here next week.